My father and my brother did this, Ava Johnson said, her voice low but unshakable, and just like that, the entire room stopped breathing. The grandfather clock against the far wall ticked once, twice, too loud in the silence, while Richard Whitmore stood frozen near the center of his own living room, a man used to controlling billion-dollar decisions now unable to move a single inch. The glass of water in his hand caught the late afternoon light spilling through 20-foot windows, trembling just enough to betray the shift inside him. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not in this house, not in that tone, not with that kind of certainty. Ava stood near the doorway in her simple uniform, the faint scent of lemon cleaner still clinging to her sleeves, her posture straight, her eyes steady, not challenging, not apologizing, just present. Like she had decided long before this moment that truth mattered more than consequence. Someone behind Richard let out a quiet, disbelieving scoff. Another whispered something about overstepping. But Ava didn't look at them. She didn't look at anyone except the man whose world she had just cracked open. That's a serious accusation, Richard said finally, his voice controlled, almost too calm, the kind of calm that usually came before everything else bent to his will. But this time it felt different, thinner, like it might break. Ava didn't raise her voice, didn't step forward, didn't perform for the room, she simply answered, "It's not an accusation, sir, it's the truth." And the words landed heavier than anything else in the room. The air shifted, thickened, as if even the sunlight hesitated to move. Richard's jaw tightened, his gaze narrowing, searching her face for hesitation, for fear, for anything that would let him dismiss her. But there was nothing there except quiet certainty. He had built his entire life on reading people, on spotting weakness before it could cost him millions, and yet this young woman, someone he barely noticed before today, stood in front of him without a trace of it. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, not louder, but sharper now, a blade hidden under silk. Ava inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadied more than just lungs, and for a brief second, her eyes flickered, not with doubt, but with memory, something deeper, something older than this house, older than his power. "I don't expect anything," she said. "I just couldn't stay silent." And that was the moment it shifted, not in the room, not in the watching eyes, but inside him, a subtle fracture he couldn't yet name. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse's voice echoed faintly from a phone left off the hook, reminding him of the hospital, of his daughter, of the reason any of this even mattered. The weight of it pressed against his chest as Ava's final words settled into the silence like something permanent. "Check the warehouse cameras," she added quietly, almost like an afterthought. 2:14 a.m. And then she said nothing more, no defense, no explanation, just stood there as the room waited for him to decide whether she was nothing, or the one person who had just told him the truth. He almost missed the silence did not break when she finished speaking. It stretched, thin and sharp, like something waiting to snap, and Ava could feel every pair of eyes in that room pressing against her skin, measuring her worth, her place, her right to even exist in that moment. But she did not move, she did not lower her gaze, because she had spent too many years being invisible to step back now. Richard Whitmore turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch the edge of his face, revealing something unfamiliar there, not anger, not yet, but uncertainty, the kind that did not belong to men like him. He walked past her without a word, his shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floor, each step controlled, deliberate, as if the ground itself needed his permission. Someone tried to speak, a quiet attempt to restore order, but he raised a hand and the room fell silent again, instinctively, because that was what power did, it commanded without effort. He reached the long console table where his phone rested, the screen still glowing faintly, and for a moment, his reflection stared back at him in the dark glass. Sharp suit, steady posture, a man who had never guessed his own judgment, until now. Ava watched from where she stood, her heartbeat slow but heavy, not from fear, but from knowing that this was the moment everything would either collapse or finally be seen. Richard picked up the phone, his fingers pausing just above the screen, and in that pause lived years of decisions, deals, victories, all built on certainty, all now confronted by a single sentence from someone he had never truly noticed. He tapped once, then again, navigating through security feeds, his movements precise, almost mechanical, as if emotion had no place in what he was about to see. The room shifted subtly behind him, people leaning forward, breath held, drawn into something they did not understand but could feel unfolding. Ava exhaled quietly, her hands resting at her sides, her uniform slightly wrinkled from a long day that had started like any other, wiping down counters, moving silently through rooms she did not belong to, until she saw something she could not ignore. The memory flickered behind her eyes, a dark warehouse, distant headlights, a sound she could not forget, but she pushed it down, because this was not about her, not anymore. The phone screen reflected in Richard's eyes now. Small moving shapes, timestamps, cold digital proof, and his jaw tightened just enough to signal that something had shifted, something real, something undeniable. No one spoke, no one dared, because the weight in the room had changed. It was no longer about a maid speaking out of turn, it was about whether the truth she carried was about to rewrite everything they believed. Ava remained still, grounded, her presence quiet but unmovable, like a line that had finally been drawn. Richard's thumb hovered over the playback, then pressed down, and in that single motion, the distance between power and truth began to disappear. The footage did not begin with anything dramatic, no sudden movement, no chaos, just a quiet frame washed in the dim glow of industrial lights, the kind that flickered just enough to make shadows feel alive, and for a second, it almost looked like nothing at all, just an empty warehouse at 2:14 in the morning, still and uneventful. The kind of place no one would look twice at. Richard leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing, searching for something that justified dismissing all of this, something that would allow him to return to certainty. But then a pair of headlights slid into view, cutting across the darkness like a blade of white light, slow, deliberate, not lost, not accidental. The vehicle stopped just within the camera's edge, and though the angle was distant, the shape was clear enough, the kind of car that did not belong in places like this, polished, expensive, unmistakable. Someone behind him inhaled sharply, but no one spoke, because even without words, they could feel the shift tightening in the air. Richard's fingers curled slightly around the phone, the faint reflection of the screen flickering across his face as he watched the driver's side door open. A figure stepped out, posture confident, movements controlled. Not hurried, not uncertain, and something about the way he stood, the way he carried himself, pulled at Richard's memory in a way that felt uncomfortable, too familiar. Ava remained where she was, her gaze fixed not on the screen, but on Richard, watching not the footage, but the moment it began to change him. The timestamp blinked in the corner, steady, undeniable, each second ticking forward like a quiet verdict. Another door opened, a second figure emerging, slightly younger, but with the same ease, the same sense of belonging in a space that should have felt foreign. The room seemed to contract, the distance between everyone shrinking as the truth began to take shape in silence. Richard's jaw tightened, not in anger now, but in recognition, the kind that did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, each piece heavier than the last. He reached out and paused the video, the image freezing mid-frame, two figures caught in motion, their outlines blurred but their presence unmistakable. No one moved, no one even shifted their weight, because something had already been decided, not out loud, not yet, but inside him. Ava's voice did not come, she did not need to say anything more, because the screen was already speaking for her. Richard zoomed in slightly, the image sharpening just enough, and though the camera was not close, though it did not offer perfect clarity, it offered enough for the mind to connect what the eyes could not fully see. Enough for certainty to begin replacing doubt. The names surfaced in his thoughts. Before he could stop it, uninvited, undeniable, and with it came a realization that did not belong to the man he had been just minutes ago. His breathing slowed, but not with calm, with weight, the kind that settled deep and refused to lift. Behind him, the room waited, suspended in that fragile space between disbelief and truth, while in front of him, the screen remained still. Holding the answer he had not been prepared to find, Richard did not speak when he unpaused the video. He only let it run, frame by frame, as if slowing time might somehow soften what he was already beginning to understand, but it did not. It only made everything clearer, sharper, impossible to deny. the first figure stepped further into the light, and though the camera angle was imperfect, those shadows still clung to the edges of the image. The posture alone was enough, the way the shoulders squared, the way the head tilted slightly as if assessing control over the space. It was familiar in a way that sent a quiet tension through Richard's chest. He had seen that stance before, across polished conference tables, in private conversations where power was never questioned, and the recognition came not like a shock, but like something heavier, something slower, settling into place with quiet certainty. Someone behind him whispered a name under their breath, too low to fully hear, but loud enough to confirm that he was not the only one seeing it now. The second figure moved into clearer view, younger, more restless in his motion, but carrying the same signature confidence, the same unspoken assumption that consequences did not apply, and Richard's grip on the phone tightened just enough for his knuckles to pale. He paused the video again, the image freezing on a moment that no longer felt distant or abstract, but personal, uncomfortably close, as if the screen had turned into a mirror reflecting something he had never intended to face. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, but there was a quiet weight in the way she stood now, not victorious, not relieved, just steady, as if she had already carried this truth longer than anyone in the room could understand. Richard inhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, and for the first time since this began, he did not look at her as someone beneath him, but as someone who had seen something he had not. His mind moved quickly, searching for explanations, for gaps, for any detail that could separate what he was seeing from what it implied, but every second of footage only closed that distance further. The timestamp continued to blink in the corner, indifferent, precise, marking a moment that could no longer be undone. "Run it again," he said quietly. Not as a command, but as a need, and the room responded instantly, because even now, even in doubt, his authority remained, but it felt different, less absolute, more fragile. The video restarted, the headlights, the doors, the figures, each movement now layered with meaning that had not existed minutes ago. Richard leaned closer, his focus narrowing, tracing every detail, every gesture, as if understanding it fully might somehow give him control over it, but control was already slipping, replaced by something far more unfamiliar. Behind him, the silence had changed, no longer tense with skepticism, but heavy with realization, the kind that settled into the bones and stayed there. Ava finally lowered her gaze for a brief second, not out of fear, but out of something quieter, something reflective, as if she knew that what was happening now was not just about truth being revealed, but about a man beginning to see the cost of what he had never questioned before. And in that stillness, with the video playing again and the truth unfolding in slow, undeniable fragments, Richard Whitmore stood at the edge of a decision that would not only define what happened next, but who he was willing to become once he could no longer pretend he did not see it. No one spoke when the video ended the second time, not because they did not have something to say, but because whatever words they had no longer felt strong enough to stand against what they had just seen. The screen went still, the frozen image lingering like a question no one wanted to answer out loud, and Richard remained where he was, phone in hand, eyes fixed forward but no longer truly seeing the room around him. The silence pressed in, heavy and unrelenting, until a voice finally broke it, hesitant, careful. "Sir, this could be misinterpreted." But even that sounded hollow, like an echo of the certainty that had filled the room earlier, now gone. Richard did not respond immediately, his mind moving through layers of recognition, denial, and something deeper that he had not allowed himself to feel in years, not in business, not in life, something that did not come with control or strategy, something that simply existed and demanded to be acknowledged. He lowered the phone slowly, the motion deliberate, controlled, but there was a subtle weight to it now, as if the object in his hand carried more than just a recording. Ava stood quietly, her presence unchanged, but the space around her had shifted, no longer dismissive, no longer skeptical, but uncertain, cautious, as if the room itself did not know how to hold her anymore. Richard turned his head slightly, not fully toward her, but enough to acknowledge that she was still there, still standing, still waiting without asking for anything. "Why did you tell me?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before, and for the first time, it was not a question meant to challenge, but one that revealed something else, something closer to searching. Ava did not answer right away, her eyes moving briefly to the floor, then back up, steady again, as if choosing her words mattered more than defending herself. "Because she is your daughter," she said simply, and the words settled into the room with a quiet force that no one could ignore. Richard's expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know how to look, but something behind his eyes tightened, then softened, as if those words had reached a place the footage alone could not. He exhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier, and for a moment, the image of his daughter in the hospital, small, still, surrounded by machines and quiet voices, replaced everything else. The room seemed to fade at the edges, the polished floors, the watching faces, all of it distant compared to the weight of that single truth. Ava continued, her voice calm, not pleading, not emotional, just honest. "I could have stayed quiet, but that would not have been right." And there was no accusation in it, no judgment, only a line drawn between what could have been done and what she chose instead. Richard looked at her fully now, really looked, not at her uniform, not at her role, but at her, and in that moment, the distance he had always maintained felt thinner, less certain, as if it had been built on something he was only now beginning to question. Behind him, the room waited again, but this time not for dismissal, not for authority to restore order, but for something else, something they had not seen from him before. Richard straightened slightly, the familiar posture returning, but it no longer carried the same unshakable certainty. It carried weight, responsibility, and something closer to hesitation. His gaze shifted back to the screen for a brief second, then to Ava again, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with a decision forming, slow, deliberate, and impossible to take back once spoken. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle and irreversible, like air changing before a storm. And Ava could feel it in the stillness, in the way no one rushed to speak, no one rushed to correct what had already been said. Richard stood with his shoulders squared, but the weight behind them was different now, no longer built from certainty alone, but from something heavier, something that required him to pause, to think, to feel in a way he had avoided for years. The late afternoon light stretched further across the marble floor, soft gold sliding between polished surfaces, catching on the edges of furniture, on the faint crease in Ava's sleeve, on the reflection of the phone still in his hand. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that did not demand attention but held it completely. Ava's gaze lowered for just a moment, not in submission, but in reflection, as if she had stepped outside of the tension and was now standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere that remembered things the room did not know. "You think this is easy?" she said softly, her voice not directed at anyone, yet heard by everyone, and the words did not challenge, they revealed. Richard did not interrupt, did not question, he simply listened, something he had not done for someone like her before. Ava's fingers brushed lightly against the fabric of her uniform, grounding herself, her breath steady, controlled, as if each word needed to pass through something deeper before it could exist. "I grew up 3 blocks from that warehouse," she continued, her tone even, but layered with something that could not be faked. "Before the buildings changed, before the streets emptied, before everything got bought and turned into something else." And though she did not say his name, the meaning settled clearly between them. Richard's eyes flickered, not in defense, not in denial, but in recognition, the kind that arrived quietly and stayed. The room seemed to fade further, the people, the walls, all of it less important than the space now held between two individuals standing on opposite sides of something neither could ignore anymore. Ava looked up again, meeting his gaze fully, not asking for anything, not expecting anything, just allowing the truth to exist without decoration. "I know what it feels like to lose something overnight," she said, and the sentence did not carry anger, it carried understanding, the kind that made it harder to dismiss, harder to ignore. Richard's breath slowed, his posture still composed, but the edges of it softened, as if the armor he wore so naturally had loosened without him realizing. The memory of his daughter returned again, not as a distant concern, but as something immediate, something fragile, something that mattered beyond control or status. Ava did not move closer, did not press further, she simply stood in that quiet space, allowing the weight of what she had said to settle on its own. The sunlight shifted again, dimming slightly as clouds moved outside, and for a brief moment, the entire room felt suspended between light and shadow, between what had been and what could no longer continue unchanged. Richard lowered his gaze, just slightly, not in defeat, but in thought, and when he looked back up, there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before, something closer to awareness than authority. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because even without words, it was clear that the next moment would not be about control, it would be about choice, and for the first time in a long time, that choice did not feel simple. Richard did not realize he had already made the decision until he heard his own voice break the silence, low and steady but carrying something unfamiliar beneath it. "Call the legal team." And the words did not echo with authority the way they once did, they landed with weight, with consequence. No one moved at first, as if the room itself needed to process what that meant, and then suddenly there was motion, quiet but urgent, someone stepping back, someone reaching for a phone, the machinery of his world beginning to turn, but this time not to protect him, not to preserve power, but to confront something it had always avoided. Ava felt the shift immediately, not in the movement, but in the intention behind it, and for the first time since she spoke, her shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in recognition that the truth had been accepted, even if the cost was still unfolding. Richard's gaze did not leave her, even as the room stirred behind him, because something in this moment was no longer about the others, no longer about the structure he had built. It was about the line he had just crossed and the one he refused to step back over. "Get me everything tied to that site," he continued, his voice clearer now, firmer, but still carrying that underlying shift. "Ownership records, development contracts, all of it." And there was no hesitation in the way the instructions were received, because even changed, his authority still held, only now it moved in a different direction. The name of the warehouse hung unspoken between them, heavy with meaning, connected not just to what the footage revealed, but to something older, something buried under years of expansion and profit. Ava watched him carefully, not with expectation, not with trust yet, but with a quiet attention, as if measuring whether this moment would last beyond the room. Richard finally looked away from her, but not to dismiss, not to distance. He looked toward the wide glass windows where the city stretched out beyond the estate, tall buildings catching the last light of day, a skyline he had helped shape, piece by piece, decision by decision. Never once looking back at what had been replaced. The reflection in the glass showed him clearly now, but it was no longer the same image. There was something else there, something that did not fit neatly into the man he had always been. "And the hospital," he added after a pause, quieter now, more personal. "Make sure she has everything she needs." And this time, the words did not feel like an order, they felt like a promise, one he was making as much to himself as to anyone else. The room slowed again, the urgency settling into a different kind of stillness, one shaped by what had already begun and could not be undone. Ava's eyes softened just slightly, not in approval, not in forgiveness, but in understanding that this was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something far more complicated. Richard turned back to her once more, and for a moment, there were no titles between them, no roles, no distance built by wealth or status, just two people standing in the aftermath of truth. "You said you grew up near that place," he said, his voice quieter than before, almost reflective, and Ava nodded once, simple, certain. He held that for a second, then gave a small nod of his own, not as a gesture of agreement, but of acknowledgement, of something seen that could no longer be ignored, and in that quiet exchange, with the city fading into dusk behind him and the room holding its breath around them, the balance of power that had once defined everything between them shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not return to what it had been before. The movement in the room slowed again, not because there was nothing left to do, but because what had been set in motion carried a weight that could not be rushed, and Ava could feel it settling into every corner of the space, into the quiet footsteps, into the hushed voices now speaking in careful tones. Instead of confident ones, Richard stood still near the center of it all. But he was no longer the axis everything revolved around, he was part of it now, part of the consequence, and that realization sat differently on him than any decision he had ever made. He turned slightly, his attention shifting back to Ava, not out of obligation, but because something in him needed to finish what this moment had started. "You could have walked away," he said, his voice quieter than before, stripped of performance, carrying something closer to honesty, and the statement was not a question, but it held one inside it. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, but there was something softer beneath it now, something that had not been there when she first spoke. "I almost did," she admitted, and the truth of it settled between them without resistance. "But then I thought about her." And she did not need to say more, because the image of his daughter existed clearly enough in both of their minds. Richard's eyes lowered for a fraction of a second, not out of avoidance, but out of acknowledgement, as if he was finally allowing himself to see the connection she had made long before he did. "People like me," Ava continued gently, "we get used to not being heard, so when we do speak, it has to mean something." And there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet understanding shaped by years that had never needed to be explained until now. The words did not accuse, but they did not excuse either, they simply existed, clear and steady, and Richard absorbed them in silence, his posture still composed, but the edges of it softer, more human than before. He stepped a little closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to shift it, to make the space between them feel intentional rather than imposed. "I should have listened sooner," he said, and the sentence did not come easily. It carried the weight of a man unaccustomed to admitting anything less than control, but once spoken, it remained, solid and unpolished. Ava's expression did not change dramatically, she did not smile, did not react in a way that made it easy, she simply nodded once, acknowledging the words without diminishing them. Behind them, the room had grown quieter, not empty, but respectful, as if everyone present understood that something larger than the situation itself was unfolding. Something that could not be interrupted. Richard glanced briefly toward the hallway where faint sounds of movement continued, the world outside this moment still turning, still waiting for the outcome of decisions already set in motion, and then he looked back at Ava, his focus steady. "This does not fix everything," he said, not as a defense, but as a recognition, and Ava shook her head slightly, her voice calm. "No, it does not." And there was no expectation in her tone, no demand for more than what was already happening. The honesty between them settled into something quieter now, something less sharp but no less powerful, like the aftersound of a bell that continues long after it is struck. The light outside dimmed further, the sky shifting toward evening, and the reflections in the glass softened, blurring the edges of the world Richard had always seen so clearly. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, and for the first time in a long time, there was no immediate plan forming behind it, no strategy to regain control, only the understanding that what mattered now could not be handled the way everything else had been. Ava stood where she was, no longer just the one who spoke, but the one who stayed, and in that quiet space between them, without raised voices or dramatic gestures, something fundamental had changed, something that would follow them beyond this room, beyond this moment. Into everything that came next. The room did not erupt when the moment passed, it settled, slowly and quietly, like dust after something unseen had shifted beneath the surface. And Ava felt it in the way the air moved differently now, no longer heavy with doubt, but with something else. Something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself. Richard stood by the window, his reflection faint against the darkening glass, the city beyond him glowing in scattered lights as evening took hold. And for the first time, he did not look at it like something he owned, but like something he was still learning to understand. The voices behind him remained low, respectful, distant, as if the room itself had agreed not to disturb what had already been decided without needing to be announced. Ava turned slightly toward the door, not in a rush, not seeking recognition, just ready to leave the space the same way she had entered it, quietly, without expectation. Her steps were soft against the marble, measured, steady, and no one stopped her, No one questioned her, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove. Halfway to the door, she paused, not because she was called back, but because something in her chose to look once more, not at the room, not at the people, but at him. Richard had not moved, but he felt it, that pause, that presence, and he turned slightly, meeting her gaze again, not as a man above her, not as someone giving permission, but as someone acknowledging what had passed between them. No words came, none were needed, because anything spoken now would only lessen what silence was already holding. Ava gave a small nod, not of approval, not of closure. Just recognition, and then she continued, the door opening softly as she stepped into the dim hallway beyond. The sound of it closing behind her was quiet, almost lost in the space, but it marked something final, something complete. Richard remained where he was, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the console, the phone now dark in his palm. The screen no longer needed to show what he had already seen. His gaze shifted back to the glass, but this time, he did not focus on the skyline. He saw something else layered within it, reflections of choices, of moments that had passed unnoticed before, now impossible to ignore. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps moved with purpose, calls were being made, actions were already unfolding, but here, in this stillness, none of that mattered as much as what had already changed. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, and for the first time, it did not carry control, it carried awareness. Outside, the lights of the city flickered against the darkening sky, distant and endless, while inside, the room held a silence that was no longer empty, but full of something that did not need to be named to be understood. Richard Whitmore stood there, not as the man who had everything under control, but as someone who had finally seen what had always been there, waiting. And in that quiet, with no audience left to impress and no words left to say, the weight of that realization settled into him, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, like a truth that would not fade even when the night fully arrived.